Hi everyone, welcome to Jawaras. Let's continue the discussion of Spring IOC container. In this video, we are going to look at how to compose Java-based configuration. That means how to use multiple Java-based configurations and how to manage them. Also, we are going to look at how to combine Java-based configuration and XML-based configuration in the same project. So let's get started. I have already created a project. This is the pom.xml file. We are using Java version 17 and I have already included a Spring context dependency. Then we have four classes. The first is main class inside main package. So it has a starting point of the application which is main method. Then we have book service class inside services package. So this has a dependency on book repository, and book repository is inside repositories package which has dependency on data source. Data source class is inside db package and which has three variables: database url, username and password, and these three properties can be injected using constructor. Now let's say we want to have different configurations for different layers of the application. So first is service layer, then there is repositories layer, and then there is db layer. So we want to have different configurations, and we want all of those configurations to be available to the Spring IOC container. So this is what we want. We want a class called service config, which will be a configuration class, and it will return a bean of type book service, but it will take a bean of type book repository. Then there is another class called repository config, which is configuration class, and it will provide a bean of type book repository, but it will take a bean of type data source. And then we have a project config class, which is also a configuration file, and it will return a bean of type data source. And what we want is we want all these three configurations to be included inside Spring IOC container. So first of all, let's create these three classes. So I will create a new package called config, and inside config, let's create a new Java class called service config, and it will create a bean of type book service, and it will take a book repository, and it will return a new book service which will have this book repository, and this will be a configuration. Now we see an error that there is no bean of type book repository available, so don't mind these errors for now. Let's create another class inside config package which is repository config, and this will be a configuration, and let's return a bean of type book repository, and it will take the data source, but the data source should be from db package. There is another package which provides data source, but we are using the data source which we created inside db package. So be sure to import that data source class only, data source, and let's return a book repository and which has this data source. And let's create another class called project config, and this is configuration file, and this provides a bean of type data source. Now let's return a new data source, but this data source has three parameters: database url, username and password. So let's provide this. So let's say db url for now, user as user for username, and paws for password. So now we have three configuration files, and we want all these three configuration files to be included inside Spring IOC container. So whenever we create Spring IOC container or Spring context in main method, we want the configuration of these three files to be included inside that. So how do we do that? So first approach is that we can mention all these three configuration files while creating application context using annotation config application context class. So we can mention all these three configuration files, and all the beans which were defined in those configuration files will be registered into the Spring IOC container. So let's do that. So create an application context. That's a new annotation config application context, and there's a project config dot class, then service config dot class, then repository config dot class. And let's print out a bean of type book service, and also print out a bean of type book repository context dot get bean book repository dot class. And let's print a bean of type data source as well, get bean data source dot class. And let's run the app, and it is working. So we have a bean of type data source which has three things: database URL, username and password, and we have book repository here, and we have book service here. So this is working fine. Now there is another method by which we don't have to mention all the configuration classes while creating the application context. We can just mention the one configuration class. For that we need to use import annotation. So we use import annotation to import other configurations as well. So if you remember, we used import tag in XML configuration to import the configuration from other XML files. Similarly, we use import annotation to import the configuration from other configuration files. And then we can just use that one configuration class to create the application context. So let's do that. So inside project config, I will use import annotation here, and this will take an array of configuration classes which we want to import. So I want to import service config.class and repository config.class. Now while creating the application context, we don't need to provide service config and repository config here. And let's rerun it. So it's working as expected. Now we don't want to hard code the database URL here. So we don't want to hard code database URL, username and password. But let's just look at how to remove hard coding database URL here. And similar approach works for username and password as well. So we will only discuss about database URL here. So for that we can use @value annotation. So @value annotation is used to read the externalized dependencies such as properties from properties file or from system properties. So then @value annotation takes the key or name of the property, and then it will inject the value of that for this instance variable. So let's do that. So in the project config, I will create a private string called database URL. And let's replace this database URL with database URL. If we run it again, so the database URL is null because it's not initialized, so it will be null. Let's use value annotation here. So the string format will be dollar, then curly parenthesis, and then the property name. So let's say property name is books.db.url. And if we run it again, now we can see the value of database URL is the exact same string which we have specified for this annotation. But we want to resolve the value of this property. So let's create a new directory inside resources, which is db, and let's say inside db we create a file called config.properties and create the property here books.db.url equal to, let's say the URL is jdbc mysql localhost 3306 db1. But if we run it again, so the value of the property is not resolved because we have not instructed the Spring IC container to resolve the value. So we need to tell that where can the container find the values for these properties. So for that we need another annotation, which is property source annotation. So this tells Spring IC container to look in these locations to resolve the values of these properties. So let's give it this annotation. So property source, and it can take a single string or it can take an array of strings as well, because there can be multiple properties file. So let's create an array of strings. Since we have only one properties file, so whatever properties files are inside resource directory, so we need to access them using class path. So class path, now we can put their path related to the resource directory. So that means inside db config.property, and if we run it again, we can see the correct database URL here. Now let's say there is no property defined, so I have commented out it here. If we run it again, now it's again uh, returning the exact same string which we have put inside value annotation. So let's say what we want is if the property doesn't have any value in any properties file, then we want a default value. So for that we can use this, we can use colon, and then we can specify the default value. So for now let's just use db url, and if we run it again, now you can see the default value is db url. Okay, because the after colon we have specified a space, so that's why this is space. Now if we run it again, you can see db url. So this is the default value. So let's remove it and let's uncomment it as well. So it's working fine. So that was all about value notation. Now let's say we want to combine Java and XML based configurations. So what we want is, let's say the configuration for book service and repository config needs to be inside Java, and the configuration for data source should go inside XML. How do we do that? So we can create the configuration for book service and repository config in Java, as we have already seen. Then we can have a empty project config, and we can import repository config and service config. So those two will be included if we include project config. Now let's say we want to create the Spring IOC container using XML configuration. Now in that case we need to include this project config as well inside XML. So inside XML we can say context colon component scan, and we can specify the package equal to config. So it will scan the config package, and it will scan for all the classes with configuration or component annotation, and it will include them inside Spring IOC container. So it will find project config inside config package, and then it will include that inside Spring IOC container. And when it will include that, the repository config and service config will also be included, because we are using import annotation. Okay. Now after that, we are creating a bean of class db.dataSource, and here we are specifying all these three properties: database URL, username and password, and their values we are reading from properties file. Now here as well we need to tell IOC container that where we can find the values of these properties. So for that we are using one annotation or one tag, which is context colon property placeholder, and we have specified the location of the properties file. So let's see that in action. So here in the inside resources, I will create a new XML configuration file, Spring config, and let's give it a name, any name, beans.xml. So now I want to create Spring IOC container using this XML configuration file. So in the main.java, instead of annotation config application context, I will use class path XML application context, and the name of the file is beans.xml. And if I run it again, it won't work because it won't find any bean. So we have not defined any bean in beans.xml. Now let's include the project config. So we can say context component scan, and this is the package name config. Let's run it again. Now you can see everything is working fine because we have included the config package. So now let's do this inside project config.java. If we remove this bean from here and if we run it again, then we will get this error because data source bean is not found. So let's create the data source bean here. So bean class equal to db.data source and constructor org or what is the constructor org name, constructor org name will be data source URL, value will be, let's say, URL for now, constructor org name will be username and value will be, let's say, USR, constructor org name will be password and value will be, let's say, 34. We run it again, it will work. So we have database URL, username and password. Now, but you are seeing this error, this warning, because we are using constructor org. So in order to use constructor org, so it will work in debug, but whenever you deploy it in the production, it won't work. So for it to work fine, go to data source, and here on top of constructor, use this annotation constructor properties, and it will be array. So the first string will be the name of first parameter which will be used in the XML. So let's say database URL, and the second will be reference using username, third will be using password, and let's rerun. Now you can see we don't see that warning, and we can see it's working fine. Now let's say instead of this hard-coded URL, what we do is we do this books.db.url. Let's rerun it, and it is not working because we need to tell Spring IC container where to look for values of these properties. So let's say context property placeholder and location, and it will be db class path db config.properties, and if we run it again, now it is working fine. And similarly you can specify the value of user and value of password from the properties as well. So that's all for this video. So in this video we learned how to compose Java based configurations, that means how to use multiple Java based configurations and how to combine them. Then we have seen how to use or how to use value annotation. Then we have seen how to combine Java based configuration with XML based configuration. So that's it for this video. I will meet you in the next video. Until then, keep learning. Bye.